All right, recording.
Oh my gosh, guys. So Josh and I have been looking over these questions, and dudes, like, I'm geeking out about how cool some of these questions are. So I don't know how much of your time I'm going to take today. I'd like to go through a few of the questions and kind of rap about them out loud. Many of these questions overlap, so by answering one, I'm touching on half a dozen of them. So I'm just going to do that for a few minutes. So this might take 20 minutes, it might take 50 minutes, so buckle up, we're going to go for a ride. Okay, so somebody asked up front about early in Robinson's description of Hobbes that Robinson evokes this concept of metaphor, particularly the metaphor of the machine. If metaphors are the farthest extent to understanding, is it then predicated that the only answers one can give are metaphoric or simile-like? In that same breath, can it be said that materialism is itself not an answer or solution? Dude, okay, great question. So, one of the things that we get to struggle with is the nature of truth itself. The reason why we have metaphors and similes is because what we're trying to discuss, we do not yet have language for. That reality exceeds the parameters of our language to talk about. And so whatever language we use is therefore always already limited to what it is that we're observing. Okay? So language is both a vehicle of understanding as well as a constraint to understanding at the same time. So therefore, to exceed the capacity of language, we use metaphor and simile to extend and broaden the language. Okay? So if I start talking about the human brain and human consciousness in relation, and I use the metaphor of computer chips, of RAM, of hard drives, as I'm talking about how the brain works, it's because I don't yet have language to talk about how the brain actually works. So I use the metaphor of a machine, in this case a computer, to talk about how it is that the brain works. So I would say that the answers we give are metaphors and similes relative to this particular question when we have not yet developed the language to adequately discuss what is actually going on. So I'm going to perseverate a bit on materialism. That's the unit where we left off, or the beginning of the unit where we left off before spring break. And with materialism, the language that we had in psychology starting off with was vastly inadequate to the complexities of the phenomenon of the brain, particularly relative to measuring the brain when events of consciousness were happening. In Thomas Hobbes's time, and he's the kind of stereotypified materialist that we're going to use, it was clockwork, it was gears and wheels and springs. That was the language that he would use and the metaphors that he would evoke, whereas for us we use the metaphors of electronics. So the whole point in neuropsychology, which is often deeply materialistic, it assumes that we are moist robots, a particular form of organic machine with squiggly juicy bits rather than hard-wired computery bits or gears and springs. That this particular field of study within psychology needs to and has been inventing language in order to talk about what's going on. And so as language is invented to talk more and more clearly about the phenomena under question, then there is less reliance upon metaphors and similes as language becomes more exacting. So rather than us talking about circuitry, for example, in the brain, now they're talking about neural connections, because neural connections are different than the metaphor of circuits. Circuits lead us to believe that the signal paths along a particular trail, right? Whereas neural connections, we find that connections happen in, like if this neuron activates, it doesn't follow just a neat trail to other neurons necessarily. In fact, rarely does it. In fact, when this neuron activates, it can activate these neurons, that activate these neurons, that activate these neurons in big clusters of activation. So therefore, this particular form of phenomena, this particular observation that brains don't act like chips, means that they needed to develop new language in order to talk about how it is that the brain is not a computer, that the brain acts very differently in some ways than computers. In fact, it went from how it is that we're thinking about brains like computers, and now it is, like some of my colleagues in artificial intelligence are now going, how can we remake computers so they're more like a brain, that rather than there being ones and zeros, to instead offer what's called quantum computing, that any given bit of data actually represents a multiplicity of possibility in terms of outcome rather than just zeros and ones. And so it's really neat the way the metaphor went one way from machines to computers, from computers to man, and now it's going the other way from man's brain back to computers again. So in the same breath can be said that materialism itself is not an answer or a solution. Okay. I love that these are hard questions. Okay, simply, yes, materialism is an answer. I'm wondering if what you meant by the question was, is it an adequate answer, a sufficient answer? And to materialists, the answer is, of course it is. We've figured it all out. It's all just material. To those who look at human beings differently, then it is an inadequate answer, that it is not a sufficient answer. So I'd like you to hearken back to, it seems like so many centuries ago, before spring break, right? That the True Monism chapter by Slife in your critical issues text, that if we look at people as a whole or true monads, then we are not singular, isolate biological creatures who are machine-like. That to a thinker, a hermeneutic thinker, an interpretivist who takes all of us up as whole monads, I am not just contained within the boundaries of my skin. I am not just a machine. Although there are regular, reliable biological processes that happen with me, neurologically, biologically, etc. And there are for you, that those are in some ways intertwined and at the same time not necessarily reliably predictable. That there are changes to our biological rhythms and responses to things. And sometimes it's variable due to disease or dysfunction, and sometimes it's just what's going on in the environment or in the context. If I get up and I were to power up, from the first floor of this building to the fifth floor of this building right now, it would certainly change some things about me biologically, physiologically, neurologically all at once. That would be effortful for me. I've already done a lot of stairs today, and I'm tired. So that's one of the reasons I'm sitting down. So a whole or true monist would say the body is important, like the brain, the nervous system, the guts, the heart, the blood, the hormones, all of that is very important, and we need to study those things. And we need to study them in relation to the broader system. And it's a very strange idea still in psychology, although they're starting to get footholds in terms of how to study this. Because it seems important that we are sharing biological phenomena together at the same time. I just serendipitously read a study just yesterday before I got your questions about the experience of a musician performing on stage and the experience of people in the audience. And they looked at it neurobiologically. So not just phenomenologically, hey musician, what experience did you have playing this piece? What does it remind you of? How hard did you practice, etc.? And then ask the audience what came to mind for you, what feelings did you have listening to this, and then correlating the experience of the musician with the audience phenomenologically. No, they did it biologically. So what they did is they found ways to put an EEG cap, like a brainwave cap, on the musician, and then did that for a controlled audience, and then looked at brainwave patterns and what parts of the brain, etc. Now, of course, when you're doing this in real time, the resolution isn't very high, and yet the phenomenon was so clear, what they found, that they didn't need a higher resolution for now. Of course, knowing my sciencey colleagues, they'll probably drive for better technology and higher resolution. What they found, though, is there was a near identical experience in terms of brain activation between or within the musician as well as her audience. So as she is performing, and she's performing the music, particular parts of her brain are active in particular ways. Likewise, as the audience was sharing the experience of music, their bodies were active in particular ways as well. Okay? So that shows that this neural phenomenon called music, or the experience of music, doesn't just happen within the body of the musician and the body of the audience, that instead that neural activation is a shared phenomenon. This neural activation is happening simultaneously between musician and audience, right, at the same time. So it's a really remarkable finding, and it just came out in the literature this week. So there are other studies as well I might get to as I read through this particular set of questions. So I just want to say that, is materialism itself an answer? Yes, it is an answer, and materialists take it up as a sufficient answer. Whereas a monist, a hermeneutic thinker, a phenomenologist would say it is necessary but not sufficient. So again, a materialist, it's sufficient. We've got it all, it's all biology, we're done. Whereas to a monist, it's no, biology is extremely important, but that's not all that's going on though. And so therefore it's a necessary explanation but not a sufficient one. So I could rap about this for another hour. I'll spare you and instead go on to another question. So does materialism address any type of soul or consciousness? Okay. Oh, how did I answer that question? No and sort of. Now, I'm not going to stop talking, of course. So now I need to qualify those terms. Like, well, Matt, what do you mean by no and sort of? Okay. So does materialism address any type of soul or consciousness, or does it just deny its existence? What are the religious implications for materialism? Do we see these impacts today? And are there any places within psychology that are not impacted by it or not completely materialistic? I ask for one question, I get half a dozen. Cheers, I appreciate it. Going not the second mile, but the third, fourth, and fifth. Okay, so let's start with Hobbes. And then we'll relate this back to your question again. So Hobbes proposed 5 absurdities. You've read your text, you know where I'm coming from here. Number 1, not knowing the meaning of the terms we're talking about, proceeding uncritically, okay? So one of the things he says is we first need to understand exactly what it is we're talking about, and then we can begin to talk sensibly about it. So we invent the language for the phenomenon in question, and then we begin to proceed by talking about that thing itself. Some of you may be feeling a sense of irony with me that Hobbes did not do this in his own philosophy very well. He tried, to his credit. At the same time, though, we're not made of gears, right? He's a materialist, and motion is a huge metaphor for him and other materialists, like the movement of chemicals across membranes, or the metaphorical gears and wheels in our heads turning and spinning as we're thinking, right? That motion is a huge metaphor for them, the cause and effect, right? The Newtonian laws of thermodynamics, equal and opposite. So motion and object in motion tends to stay in motion. And yet if he's resorting to metaphor, then does he really get the terms of what it is he's talking about when it comes to human beings, if he is using machine-like metaphors to talk about us? It seems like he's having to borrow a language in the form of a metaphor, and that metaphor may show that he doesn't really understand the subject in question. So number 2, confusing the material with the immaterial, things like feeling the spirit or being infused with faith, he saw as absurd, that there are material things and immaterial things, and we shouldn't confuse the two. And because physical bodies are material, therefore physical bodies are only having physical experiences about physical things. So therefore feeling the spirit is not actually feeling any spirit, any spiritual entity, right? It is instead having a certain physiological reaction because the way stimuli in the environment created motion within my body that arose these particular feelings through my nerve endings and brain. So he stuck with that one really well. So on number 1, not really knowing the subject matter well enough, we can critique him there. But number 2, he stuck to his guns there. So do not confuse the material with the immaterial. So we're having a bodily response to something, a burning in the bosom, electrical feeling in the skin, goosebumps, whatever else we call it, feeling the spirit. He says, no, that's just nerves, right? It's just things going on in your body. Number 3, believing in the reality of universals. And so, wow. That there is nothing universally true, according to Thomas Hobbes. So if you evoke a construct like heaven or God, that is a universal concept. And he throws it out and he says, no, there is no universal there. There are no universals at all, which also then throws some of Newton's observations under a pretty harsh light as well. When are there exceptions to Newton's laws? And some of you who have taken science classes go, well, there's a bunch, right? That's why we have relativity. So Thomas Hobbes, who's of course writing and thinking long before Albert Einstein, is arguing that nothing is universally true. So number 4, the use of metaphor instead of observable reality. And again, like with 1, he kind of falls on his face here a little bit. He does it gracefully, right? He's a pretty compelling writer. At the same time, though, he still uses some pretty interesting mechanistic or materialistic metaphors when he's talking about us, about human nature, about human beings, not us personally. So in psychology, this is especially important. I'd like to offer something to consider, and that is that in our field, we tend to talk about things that we cannot directly, empirically, physically observe. Okay? So I can't observe your personality if you're sitting in my class quietly. There's nothing there. There's a being there, and I can see that there's a being there. I don't know if that being is an introvert or an extrovert, if they are neurotic or calm, if they are open to experience or closed and more compulsive. I can't tell just by looking at somebody what their personality characteristics are. So, therefore, I will operationalize personality in the form of a paper and pencil test. Now, operationalization, if you remember from one of our earlier units, is when I have a phenomenon that I cannot directly empirically observe, personality, and then I find a way to directly measure something that is related to personality. So I'll write questions about personality and then ask somebody to respond, and I can count empirically their responses. Like in the case of the MMPI, it's true or false, right? You take 542 questions on this huge personality test called the MMPI, and it's just true or false, bits and bytes of data. Okay, zeros and ones, true and false. And then I just count up the trues and count up the falses in particular subcategories, then I can say, oh, this person's neurotic, okay? Or they are extroverted or traditionally masculine or whatever characteristics I'm trying to observe. But I've operationalized it, but I'm not directly observing their neuroticism or their schizoidness or anything like that. Instead, I'm just observing what's on a paper and pencil and hoping that my studies are proving, or that my study is valid, my research is valid, this particular measure is valid to actually measure the real phenomenon, which is their personality. How do marks on a paper then reveal personality? And so psychologists take it up as true that it does. Now, Hobbes might be very critical of this because the operationalization, right? When we take up a metaphor for experience, we're not talking about the experience itself, hence the importance of the last question. That it's not talking about experience itself. Instead, we've taken a metaphor. These responses on this particular piece of paper, the clicks on this particular website that I'm counting up, that's all I'm actually observing. I'm not actually observing the phenomenon in question. This is a metaphor for this other thing that I don't have language for, or I can't really describe well enough for it to be compelling to my peers. So, in psychology, we use metaphor all the time. In fact, it seems to be the way we speak in psychology. So, I think with Hobbes, that would be a pretty big deal. Now, it also relates to his fifth absurdity, using terms which do not directly relate to experience. He says you need to use concrete terms about concrete and observable experience. So it's interesting how narrowly he defines experience. He defines experience as that which is physically sensible, meaning I can see it for what it is, I can hear it for what it is, and therefore that's the categories by which I need to talk about what it is. I need to talk about the thing itself. If I'm going to talk about it, I need not to be absurd. I need to talk about that thing. Now, this is interesting because he presumes that the thingness of the thing, meaning that which makes it to be what it is in and of itself. right? It is essentially what it is in and of itself, apart from the context of it and our relationship to it. So, my water bottle. That this water bottle is what it is without my relating to it, according to Hobbes. So therefore, it is just a water bottle, and the nature of water bottleness informs me through my physical senses what this particular object is. And so I can only use terms which relate directly to experience. Now, Hobbes has put himself in a very difficult position by arguing this, because this water bottle, okay, being what it is, does it have certain exclusive categorical stimuli, right? Things that I can observe about it that are exclusive just to water bottles. Is roundness or oblongness or cylindricalness exclusive to water bottles? Well, no. Is lidness or twistiness exclusive to water bottles? No. Is steel and plastic exclusive to water bottles? Well, no. Oh, so he's positing as an absurdity that something kind of puts him in an intellectual trap, and that is that water bottleness is not directly observable. This water bottle is directly observable, but the phenomenon of water bottleness itself is not. And so if I had a short plastic fat water bottle, I would say, okay, are they both water bottles? Like, look at their characteristics. And so if I'm using terms that do not relate directly to the experience of water bottleness, but water bottleness itself, just the experience of water bottleness exceeds easy categorization, right? My experience of this object as a water bottle, I'm not simultaneously experiencing all water bottles, and yet I know this is a water bottle. So he's got a little bit of a philosophical struggle there. Of course, Hobbes is sharp enough, he's aware of that, and struggles with it mightily. At the same time, though, there are things about this particular phenomenon that exceed mere direct sensory observation, and that is the essential definitional category of it as water bottle. So it gets into one of Plato's problems. Of course, you guys remember Plato had to evoke the forms, that there is a perfect form of water bottleness in the realm of forms, and this is merely a incomplete instantiation of that particular phenomenon of water bottleness. Huh. Imagine how much more acutely true this would be for people. Like if we start thinking in terms of mental health and mental illness, or just what a human being is in and of themselves, like what would it mean? What do we observe directly? What does it mean to be human? He's trying to remove all of those very important phenomenological and existential kinds of questions because, well, certainty. Hobbes is attempting to give us a philosophy that will allow us to be certain about the phenomenon in question and the phenomenon that we're observing. If we can remove these absurdities and just let things be what they are and sense them for what they can be certain that they are what they are. So jokingly, as you can see, the sticker on my water bottle is hidden burrito inside. And so this is my way of joking that things aren't necessarily what they appear, and therefore Hobbes is, among others, Hobbes isn't the only one, but many of the empiricists, materialists, etc. fall into this trap, that things aren't just what they are. You know, I will admit, eating a burrito out of this isn't easy, but it can be done. Okay? I prefer to keep water in this, and yes, it took me a while to wash it out, but I can eat burritos out of this. Okay? So, whether or not I should is a different question. So back to your questions. Does materialism address any type of solar consciousness? And the answer is no. And yes, Hobbes struggled with this. Unfortunately, because Hobbes was struggling with consciousness, he kept putting it back in the category of motion, in the category of cause and effect kinds of activities, kind of processes. And so he was trying to still rescue the notion of consciousness to a degree within his own materialist philosophy. Like, if you guys remember that he talks about motion, for example, particularly animal motion, which takes two forms, involuntary and intentional. So intentional motion of the limbs is caused by interior parts of our bodies to meet their material demands. And so if there is a part of my body that is lacking or sending a particular stimulus, then he says that that's intentional, but it's really mechanistic, meaning that if there is something I want to get or something I want to do, it's because some part of my body given stimulus that it is giving off because of some kind of deficit in energy it has, to then reach out and go get something. For example, I'm drinking a little bit of tea and drinking water, and it's because my body is sending signals, Matt, you're dehydrated after your workout and after filming these videos for 3 hours straight. And my body is right, it is dehydrated. And so it's sending those signals, and therefore, what seems to be an intentional action, my reaching for and grabbing my hidden burrito holder, taking a drink and then setting it down, that seems to be intentional, right? But you'll notice what he's doing is he is taking the consciousness out of it, that what seems to be intentional is actually just the mechanisms of the body operating, that there doesn't need to be a conscious mind actually engaging in this particular behavior for him to call it intentional. In fact, it is just stimulus and response. So think of it as internal stimuli, right? That this voluntary, intentional, intentional motion is something within me is in motion, creating other motions in order for this to happen. My system is moving in a particular way because it's dehydrated, and therefore they're reaching for the hidden burrito holder, taking a big swig of sweet, sweet salsa, more like habanero and savory, is what's going on with me. Okay, there's not a consciousness that is intending, or if there is a consciousness that is intending, Hobbes makes that also just parts of the brain or parts of the system that are moving in operation because other parts of the system are in motion. And so what causes this motion is usually processes within the mechanistic processes within the body, as well as, the material processes within the body, as well as material processes coming at the body from outside in the form of stimuli. So not that I use the term stimuli. So motion is caused by appetites, which he then calls desire, and so that is the more you read about involuntary and intentional motion, the more it just gets down to where is the source of the motion originating. So in a Hobbesian materialism, is there a type of solar consciousness? The answer is sort of. If you take that up as a mechanistic process, then yes, there is. If you mean soul as in a part of our body that is not caused through material, physical, chemical processes, that there is a part of us that can cause, that has will or agency or choice that can then create new possibility in a cause and effect world, well, the answer is no. Materialists don't have that particular understanding of the soul. So what a non-materialist calls the soul is going to be pretty different than what a materialist calls the soul. In fact, after Hobbes, if we look at modern materialism, they've given up on any and all language about the soul. So the next question is, or does materialism just deny its existence? And the answer is, sometimes yes. And I don't mean materialism as a philosophy denies its existence, because again, they can say, well, this internal mechanism and process is intentional, even though there's no real chooser, because everything's just cause and effect, right? That even your choices are caused by other things. There is instead a group that say, no, and talking about the spirit or soul is in and of itself deeply problematic. So if you have time and you're interested in the answers to these questions, look up Daniel Dennett. And so he's got some fun TED Talks, and I would like you to watch them and be critically open to what it is that he is saying. Critical because we're thinkers, we're intellectuals, we're critical of everything we're told, looking for the possibilities of whatever we're being told fitting the world or adequate explanations in the ways in which they're inadequate at the same time. So that's critically open. Like, hear what he has to say, take him seriously, and at the same time, really think of the limitations of his argument. One of the things that Dennett argues, like he's got some TED Talks, for example, in some of his literature, Dennett argues that consciousness is epiphenomenal, meaning your experience of your conscious world is not what's really going on, that it's apart from the story. Epi meaning apart from, phenomena means experience, that the reality of yourself, your consciousness, your reality is apart from your awareness thereof. And he's done some very fun and very interesting studies that demonstrates a lot of what goes on with us we're not even aware of. That there are a lot of things that are prompting our quote-unquote decisions that he can measure in advance and then better predict what choices we're going to make. That there, let's say I ask you a question. I show you 6 types of ice cream, 3 types of gelato, and 3 types of sorbet. So ice cream's got dairy in it, gelato's got a lot of dairy in it, sorbet doesn't have any dairy in it. And I ask, okay, which one of these do you want? And then he can measure in advance to your deciding how your brain is processing that in a way that pre-predicts what decision you're going to make. Meaning that he can know in advance, even if it's microseconds in advance, what you're going to choose before you have the experience of having made your choice. So therefore it's easy for him to extend that and make an argument that it's all stimulus response. You think you're making a choice, but in actuality, the responses in your brain are already operating from the stimuli in the environment before you're even aware that you're making a choice. Now, those of you who are Dennetites, fans of Daniel Dennett, you know I'm grossly oversimplifying, and yes I am, for the sake of argument, hopefully not making a straw man. A straw man is where you build an argument out of a little bit and then burn it down like you're attacking an issue that's not the real issue at hand, or an exaggeration of the issue in the case of an ad absurdum argument. For now, we get to take that seriously. Okay, so are the materialists right? Does this mean that we are just stimulus response creatures? That it's just, there's a stimuli in the environment and it kicks off a particular response neurologically, and that my awareness, my conscious awareness of that is really not what's going on at all. And in fact, my conscious awareness is beside the point. In fact, Dennett, in some of his literature, even calls conscious awareness fictoplasm. Like your consciousness is fiction. Like, if you guys remember the Ghostbusters movies from back in the day, that ghosts leave behind what's called an ectoplasm, right? That it's just this remnant left by something that's ephemeral and unreal, these things called ghosts, right? Your consciousness is just a fictoplasm. It's just a fiction. It's beside the point. It's what's left over after reality is doing what it's doing. So, therefore, extending your question, what are the religious implications for materialism? Well, there's no God. Boom. Okay? That God, like if we were to take the absurdities, Hobbes' 5 absurdities, and we were to hold those up against any religion I know about, then they are absurd. They're absurd 5 times over. Not meaning the terms we're reasoning about, proceeding uncritically. Some people argue that religion requires uncritical engagement. That's why many religions are what is the word? Critical of criticism. Meaning that to be learned is good insofar as you adhere to the commandments of God. So you can be smart, just don't question us, okay? And so I hope you see that could do violence to a religious system or religious culture, practice of religion. Confusing material with immaterial, we've already hit on that one, right? That if you're having a burning of the bosom or feeling the spirit, this is just a biological process due to stimulating the environment. There is no spirit that is caused. That's an immaterial thing. And the immaterial cannot affect the material. It's something that's haunted philosophy. Remember Descartes' struggle with how it is that consciousness, which seems to be immaterial, can affect the material so deeply. And all of his attempts to try to talk about how those, these energies, these animal spirits, and the connection between the body and the psyche through the pineal gland, etc., that there were these particular things going on. So, believing in universals. As far as I know, most religions posit or apply or argue for universals, that all people are children of God, for example. If from certain Judeo-Christian traditions, that would be a belief in a universal, or that only our church is true, whichever church says that. That's a belief in a universal. And so using metaphor instead of observable reality. So if I'm taking up an experience as a curse from the devil or a sign of my own unrighteousness, like I'm running late for work and I got a red light, and I managed to hit all the red lights on my way to work, and it makes me even later, and I can go, oh, this is because I kicked a kitten yesterday or masturbated 2 days ago. Well, that's then using a metaphor instead of observable reality. You're finding a way in which to make yourself control over the world by metaphorizing this thing called sin, when actually what's going on is, statistically, you just happen to hit all the lights, and sometimes the dice roll against us, and sometimes they roll for us. Dang it, dice are a metaphor too. Okay, so using terms which do not relate directly to experience. And in religion, there's a ton of terms that don't relate directly to our experience, and it can be very alienating for some people in some religions to be told about certain experiences, and that spiritually religious-y people have those experiences, and then when somebody doesn't have them, they feel like either that church isn't true, or they feel aberrant, like they feel like somehow they're broken or wrong. So, do we see these impacts today? And the answer is yes. Imagine a psychologist. Okay, try to imagine this. A psychologist who is openly Christian, and her Christianity informs her research, and she's very open about her Christianity and how that informs her research. Try to imagine that person existing. Okay, I have a very vivid imagination, so I can picture her. But just like I can picture the red dragon in my Dungeons and Dragons game last week, right? It's a fictional character. This woman doesn't exist. Our modern intellectual system does not tolerate religious people writing religious research for religious ends heavily biased by religion. It doesn't happen. In fact, I had a very interesting conversation with a colleague of mine who's an African-American psychologist. And he was raised in the South and suffered a lot of racism as a child and young adult, and then other forms of disguised and implicit racism as an adult. Successful, competent, really, his work is inspiring. And the other day in my office, he said something that I found deeply meaningful. He said, you know, I've suffered a lot of racism in my life. And he says, professionally, I've suffered some too as a psychologist. People keep presuming that because they've read a study on what African Americans are, they think they know who I am. He said, but the real struggle for me is that I experience far more bias from my colleagues in this field because I'm openly Christian. Like, you come into my office and there's a portrait of Christ, I'm a pastor in my church, I am openly Christian, and their assumption then is I must somehow be deranged, deluded, or stupid that I am openly Christian. And that really meant a lot to me. It really hit me deeply that we have such a strong anti-religious bias in the field of psychology. Now, not just psychology, don't get me wrong. Like, if you go to medical school and they teach you to raise your hands above a patient, praise Jesus, and walk out of the room, that medical school is going to close pretty soon. So, or at least it should close pretty soon. At the same time, we can see that there's an anti-religious bias. Now, something that we don't have time to get into today, it's a little bit in your text, is the reason why anti-religious bias came about. And it's because, and I'm putting this far too briefly, it is a battle of certainties, okay? That there were those who were certain about what they were doing, what they were experiencing, and what it meant, and they were certain from within the frame of their religion. And so therefore my religion tells me that this is the nature of reality, this is the nature of me, and this is the nature of you, and that's certain, and that gives people confidence and comfort in their world. Likewise, there were other people who developed a different model of uncertainty. They argued, actually, this religion thing is far from certain. Look at the ways in which religion contradicts itself. Many religions contradict themselves all over the place. So therefore, that's uncertain. What's far more certain is the empirical things we can taste, touch, feel, etc., like through our physical senses. That's a form of certainty. And so, in the battle of certainties, science has in some ways won out over religion. And where science very much succeeds is science, this materialistic science that we've been talking about today, really tells us a lot about the nature of these chairs, how they're made up chemically, how we can recreate them reliably at different times and places. The nature of the technology I'm using to talk to you all right now, that all of this is reliably, predictably, materially reproducible and recreatable. Whereas religious experience isn't. If I were to bust out into a gospel hymn right now and just start praising the Lord and I'm feeling the Spirit, it doesn't mean necessarily that you would be, and no, you can't pay me enough to do that, okay? So it's one form of certainty. In fact, the scientists would call it a true form of certainty over another. Why religion is still clinging on, though, is there's a lot of experiences that we have that it doesn't seem that science can tell us anything about. Okay? Why do I grieve? Well, Hobbes would just say, well, it's mechanical, right? It's energy, it's this particular motions. And yet that is obviously not what's going on to those of you that have grieved. If I'm laughing with my friends, well, what's going on with that? So when it comes to our emotional and psychological experiences, the materialists have a hard time, and they often epiphenomenalize it away, like Daniel Dennett does. Because part of your brain is lighting up before you're aware of the experience, therefore your brain mechanically was making a decision, although it can't make a decision because it's just a machine, before you had the experience of having made the decision. Therefore there was no actual decision the way we think of decisions having ever taken place. Now, that's a form of certainty. Another form of certainty is, well, Jesus made me choose the gelato, right? And that's another form of certainty. Unfortunately, that is not transmittable or reliable, and it's questionably valid across individuals in terms of their gelato choices. Now, some of you would say gelato is the superior frozen beverage, therefore it is always Jesus' choice, and then we got a debate on our hands. We should create a Facebook page where people can just flame war one another about this. Okay? Now, science seems to save us from that uncertainty. For those of you that have actually done science, you find that there's just as many flame wars within that as well. That both needs for certainty have created a certain set of unnecessary problems. And there are religious types who are aware of this, and science types who are aware of this, and science religious type, people who are religious and do science are aware of this as well. And so what they're trying to do is talk about the need for uncertainty. Like if you were to walk down the hallway today, I don't know when you're going to see this video or if it'll be here when you walk down the hallway, but when you do so, one of my colleagues has an article published in a psychology journal that says the importance of stupidity in science. Unabashed. And what the article is actually calling for is an embracing of proximity over certainty. That we're approximately aware that these kinds of phenomena correlate within the brain. A does not cause B within the brain, but they tend to happen together a certain percentage of the time, right? You need to be stupid, he argues, because he believes that stupidity is uncertainty. For some of us, it's the embracing of uncertainty that is the highest form of intellect. And so I can kind of disagree with the author's language there. Regardless, there are religious people who do the same thing. That, for example, I go into a local church and I am told that obeying the commandments makes you happy. So there are rules of that particular religion, and obeying those rules makes you happy. And they define happy as worldly, pleasurable kinds of things, like good feelings and good events happen in terms of feeling good. Like, I was really stressed about paying my tithing, and I did, and then they lost my mortgage bill, and I didn't have to pay my mortgage that month, and that made me happy because then I had a few $100s to spend on my kids for Christmas, and that made them happy, and that's Jesus or God or Heavenly Father doing, okay? Well, that's a particular form of certainty. There are others who acknowledge, no, it's not about certainty. In fact, certainty and faith are enemies. Some of you say, wait, Matt, I've read my scripture, and the scripture says faith is knowledge of things unseen. Yeah, they're unseen. You're only looking at half of the sentence, okay? You know that there's something there. You're not sure what. In fact, a colleague of mine is not devoutly Christian. He was raised in a Christian home 100 years ago, but does not identify as such now. He has a great philosophical way of putting it, both for the scientists as well as for the religious people. He says, I don't think I'm right, but I know I'm not wrong. There's something going on here. I'm just not sure what it is. I love that. I'm not sure that I'm right, but I know I'm not wrong, okay? That I don't think I'm right, but I know I'm not wrong. And so likewise, for religious people, that same attitude can and sometimes does apply. That I don't know how it is that this faith endeavor is going to fit you or what experience you're necessarily going to have, but I know in general that this can be an important experience or an important thing to try to do. So I was thinking, I had some health problems, and I went to, in 2 years, 4 or 5 physicians, and they all gave me the same advice. Well, just lose weight, just lose weight. In fact, I would walk in, begin to describe the problem, and several of them just cut me off and said, well, if you just lost weight, okay? So I lost a ton of weight, and my health problems got a lot worse. And so finally I found a physician that said, okay, let's actually look at how it is that you don't fit the standard models. Okay, I'm 6.5 feet tall, I have a very thick build. Let's look at how your heart's functioning, how your guts are functioning, and it took a while. It was about, several $1,000s in tests. And he presented me a picture of how it is that I am abnormal physiologically and how it is I need to do these other things instead in order to deal with my health problems. And lo and behold, it was extremely successful. So likewise, that can happen religiously. Why the fuck don't we swear in church anymore? Okay? Well, it's because some people are offended by it, and it's okay and important that they get offended by it. At the same time, though, what are we also not talking about in church? What kind of miseries and experiences are we also not discussing? How it is that we can bring the things unseen back to our knowledge of them. So if I am suffering and I have faith, what I'm not seeing is a deity's relationship to my suffering. So therefore I have faith that this deity is relating, but I can't see how. Okay, do you guys get how certainty is the enemy to faith? Oh, God, no, God's making me suffer because I'm suffering. It's got to be God. No, I think the blessing of uncertainty is a powerful one for both scientists as well as religious types. And so what these materialists are doing is trying to take away the uncertainty. And so some of my colleagues call it the Cartesian neuroses, referring, kind of slapping Descartes around. That Descartes wanted certainty, he was craving certainty. So hence his hypothetico-deductive method, right, is a way to be certain about his conclusions and the truthfulness of his conclusions. So therefore he endeavored this particular method to provide a sense of certainty to himself and as well as us. And why do we need certainty? And so that's a question that the materialists aren't asking, the empiricists aren't asking, the rationalists aren't asking. Hell, we have to get to the patristics before we find people to say, certainty can be a problem. And then after all of these philosophers, back to maybe we need a healthy dose of uncertainty. So later we'll get into things like skepticism, etc. So I'm out of time today, and I don't mean to imply that other questions weren't worthy or interesting. I've got a great question here from Mills, about Mills. I've got another question about Hobbes, although I think I answered most of the Hobbesian questions. Oh man, Hobbes and the relationship to royal people, those who believe themselves to be fundamentally separate from or better than others, Hobbes takes them down a huge notch. And then Descartes, we're kind of beyond the Descartes unit, although that was a brilliant question too. So, and then the cultural transition from a dualism to a monism, because as you know, Hobbes is pushing us more in a monistic direction. So hopefully we'll get to maybe some of these questions. I know you have another group questions coming, and where they overlap, the old questions with the new questions, I'll try to hit those up next time we meet. So thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you later.